Okay, let's take a deep breath. That felt good, didn't it? This week, honestly, has been a lot. Before diving in, let's take a look at the top 5 headlines of the week in 30 seconds or less. Okay, here we go. Timer set. 1, Democrats unveil 2 articles of impeachment against Trump. 2, Trump meets with Moscow's top diplomat amid the impeachment probe. 3, the top Republican on the House Judiciary Committee calls for Adam Schiff to testify. 4, spending on TV ads focused on impeachment soars. And 5, Mitch McConnell says the impeachment trial will begin, quote, around the time bowl games end. With impeachment hearings, it's easy to get caught up in the nitty-gritty fights over parliamentary procedure, point of order, Mr. Chairman, arcane congressional rules, and yes, lots and lots of partisan infighting. Every so often, then, it's important to take a step back and reflect on where this falls on the timeline of American political history. What came before this to make it possible? Should we have predicted this? And most importantly, how does this whole thing compare to the past times presidents have been impeached? To help me break all of this down, I am joined by CNN presidential historian, which is an awesome title, Timothy Neftali. Tim is an expert when it comes to history and impeachment history. He's the founding director of the Federal Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. He also has authored the library's nationally acclaimed exhibit on Watergate and oversaw the release of 1.3 million pages of presidential documents and nearly 700 hours of the infamous Nixon tapes. Tim currently teaches intelligence, history, and national security policy at NYU, where he is the director of the public policy major. Let's start. There's obviously a ton of comparisons to Nixon. What is right about the comparisons between what happened with Nixon and what is happening with Trump? And probably more importantly and interesting, what's wrong with those comparisons from your viewpoint?
The House Judiciary Committee passed or approved 3 articles of impeachment in the Nixon case. The first was for obstruction of justice. The second was for abuse of power. And the third was for contempt of Congress, because President Nixon had complied partially, but not completely, with requests for information. When I boiled down the entire Ukraine matter, for me, it's this question. Are you comfortable if the President of the United States thinks there's no cost whatsoever to him, maybe someday to her, in deciding to go abroad to collect dirt on an American citizen? In the Nixon case, Richard Nixon used the instruments of government to collect dirt on his domestic political opponents. In the case of Donald Trump, he has used the instruments of foreign policy to hurt American citizens. To my mind, what's really dangerous is when you have a president with the enormous power of the presidency using that power to hurt us individually. That, for me, is the connection between Nixon and Trump.
We have heard Democratic members of Congress say this is actually worse than what Nixon did. I'm just trying to give people who are watching some context of, everyone knows Nixon left office, right?
Yes.
Is this, to your point, on abuse of power? There's a clear similarity. Is that where the similarity ends, to your mind?
Well, Richard Nixon complied with some of the requests for information. What he didn't do was he did not comply with the subpoena from the House Judiciary Committee. They asked for tapes. And instead of giving tapes, he gave transcripts, and he gave edited transcripts.
Yep.
And he said, look, if you want, the chair and the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee can come and listen to the tapes. Well, what the committee said, and by the way, a bipartisan majority said, this is not compliance with the subpoena. Right. We want the actual tapes. We want to listen to them ourselves and then make our own transcripts. So in one sense, there is a similarity, because what Richard Nixon didn't hand over were the goods. Richard Nixon gave some things in order to give the impression of compliance, because in that era, the American people expected compliance. And I want to get to that.
Yes.
I want to get back to that in a moment. But in large measure, Richard Nixon did not give the House Judiciary Committee what it needed. And there, too, there's a similarity with Trump.
Yeah. You mentioned the sort of the moment. So I want to talk about the man, comparing the men and the moment. So Nixon and Trump, personality-wise, similarities, differences, then the moment, because you mentioned that the American people at that point expected compliance during Nixon.
All right.
So let's talk about what they are like personally, and then let's talk about the moment in which they both found themselves president.
Okay. Nixon was an introvert. He was not good at defending himself. He actually didn't want to engage with people. His advisors had to push him to make statements. This wasn't just a matter of about Twitter. Of course, Twitter didn't exist then. but he didn't want to make statements. He didn't even take trips outside of the White House. His advisors were saying to him, "You've got to defend yourself." When he would meet with members of Congress, Nixon refused to talk about Watergate. I'm talking about with Republicans. Donald Trump, you can't stop. The exact opposite. He's an extrovert. I don't think Donald Trump has any sense of the Watergate story, but I think there are people around him who have learned some lessons from Nixon's mistakes. But two of the lessons that I learned in studying the Watergate issue was one that Nixon's semi-compliance was a disaster. Either you have transparency,
one or the other.
Because you're innocent, and if you're guilty, please don't do this, by the way. There's almost no incentive.
Don't comply. Yeah.
So I think they learned that lesson. And the other is spin. Give your allies spin. Give them something to say.
Yeah.
Nixon did neither one effectively. The other big difference is the American public is different.
The moment, right.
And here, I don't know what we can do, because, Trump may disappear, from the political scene in a year, or he may disappear in 4 years. But the challenge to the republic is not just from President Trump, it's from Trumpists. And they're not going to go away. There was a time when Americans trusted their government. In fact, and this will surprise a lot of folks, there was a time when Democrats trusted their government even if a Republican was president, and vice versa.
Right.
After Watergate, not only, you have two things happen. Not only does general trust in government plummet, but people's trust in government begins to be partisan. That was something new.
Yep.
And
I think that is news to a lot of people, because it's hard to imagine that not being the case, because it seems like it's been so entrenched.
Now, if you accept the proposition that Americans trusted government, and you're president of the United States, you have to comply with Congress. Americans expect you to comply because they trust their Constitution.
That the government is doing the right thing.
And that it's fair.
Right.
That the system is fair. If, on the other hand, you are so poisoned by feeling or assuming that that the system of government is unfair, that it is a swamp, that no one is thinking of the national interest, that everybody is out for themselves, then contempt of Congress to you means nothing.
Tim, thank you.
Chris, pleasure.
What I was most struck by in that conversation is the differences both between Nixon, the introvert, and Trump, the very extrovert, and the moment in which they are both president. Nixon president at a time when people trusted their government to do the right thing. Trump at a time when people, particularly his supporters, applaud him for not cooperating with Congress. So it's a man and a moment that combine to make these things different, but also similar enough that we can learn from them. Totally fascinating. What did you like, not like? What do you want to see us talk about on impeachment or politics in general? Put it all in the comments section. Remember, we do point episodes every Tuesday, Thursday, and a special impeachment-focused episode like this one every weekend. Check them all out.